to Being Athletic in Perimenopause and Beyond. My name is Tenille. I am an integrated sport and health and performance coach. So I coach triathlon and cycling and running, and I am so pleased to welcome Dr. Richard Blagrove here today in our conversation. So welcome.
Yeah, thanks very much for the invitation to come on and speak.
It is absolutely a thrill. I've been looking forward to this conversation because it's something that is dear to my heart as I've been trying to learn everything I can to understand about strength training. And it's complicated, it's simple in some ways, and we are going to dig into it. But I'm going to let everybody know just a little bit more about you. You are a senior lecturer in physiology and a program leader for the Masters of Science Strength and Conditioning at Loughborough University, and that's in the UK, right? Did I say that wrong?
No, all that's correct. Except it's pronounced Loughborough. Yeah.
Loughborough. I knew I was going to get the pronunciation wrong. What is really interesting about what you're doing there is that you're investigating the physiological factors that underpin performance and endurance running specifically, and how strength training exercise can be used as a tool to improve metabolic cost of running. So by metabolic cost of running, can you just clarify what you mean exactly by that, just a little bit more?
Yeah, I'm mainly just talking about running economy, which is one of the main physiological determinants of running performance.
Right.
So it's essentially how much energy, and that's kind of what I mean by metabolic cost, so how much energy we're using at any given submaximal running speed.
Perfect. Because it's always about the energy, isn't it? It's always about how we want to use. And when I tell my athletes, I'm like, you want to use the least amount of energy possible to do the thing you're doing. And if you can be more lazy, then get more lazy. And not in the sense of, slouching and doing all these things, but like, where are you gripping your hands? If you're on your bike, like, where are you gripping your hands? And I think this is coming into a whole science of what you're doing, is trying to figure out how do we, this is going to be the question, like, how do we be strong to be efficient? And where is that, where's that idea? But in any case, great. Okay, so you also are interested in the health related associated with endurance sports, and in particular, the low energy availability on musculoskeletal health. So I'm just going to dig into that a little bit more. So you're really looking at, so when people are not taking in the required nutrition for the activities that they're doing, you're looking particularly at how does our muscle, how do we not maintain our muscle? How do we, Yeah,
pretty much. It's probably best captured in a syndrome known as the relative energy deficiency in sport syndrome, which I'm sure you've heard of, and many of your listeners would have heard of as well. And it essentially means that over a long period of time, that we're essentially just not taking in enough energy to support the amount of exercise and physical activity that we're doing. And the kind of what's left over, which is for physiological functioning, isn't sufficient to support those processes. And when that happens, like, it causes a whole bunch of physiological perturbations and negative consequences, several of which affect our muscles and our bones. And so what I'm interested in is if we've got athletes that have experienced RED-S, and some of them have even had eating disorders as well, how's that impacted their muscles and their bones, and what role does strength training play as part of the kind of recovery and rehabilitation process to allow them to get back into their training and then get back into competitions and performance?
It's really interesting. And this is just an aside, and my just thinking is, many women that are listening to this, it may resonate in that there's been such a culture of like diet and not eating sufficiently for the activities that we do, that when we understand the role of, and we'll be talking about this, everyone, but the role of strength and why it's so beneficial for our health. But it's interesting that you put in this context of for rehabilitation, like to get strong again, to address so many of the issues that we've been having on relative energy deficiency. And in past summits, I have had experts in relative energy deficiency in sport, specifically because we think very often oh, well, that's just for the young ones.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
just for the younger people. And in fact, it is really prevalent among age group athletes, endurance athletes that are in the masters categories, because we have never actually been fueling enough. And so this context of like, we can, how the benefits to not only just bring us into optimal health, but bring us into health, and how that process is going. So we'll talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure.
You have been working since 2008. You were an accredited strength and conditioning coach. You have been working specifically, and what's interesting about this is that not only do you have this research role in this academic life, you're really bringing this into your athletes and have been working with athletes over the last 15 years as well, and seeing like, make sure that this translates into, it's like great to study it, but let's make sure it translates into real performance. And some of your athletes have won international championships or medals at major international championships, and that's been exciting. And anything you want to say about that and the journey that you've had?
Yeah. No, you're exactly right. And like, it's actually been the other way around. Like, I started off as a strength and conditioning coach, and I guess that's where my passion has always lied. But as you probably know, like, if you work in higher education in a university setting, like, being an active researcher is really important for your career and your career progression. And so there's always kind of this pressure to get involved with research and be in the lab and do kind of world leading science and so on. And so that's become more important as my career's progressed. But I like to think I'm still very much a strength and conditioning coach at heart. And when I have the time, I'll be in the gym coaching athletes or supporting them from distance. Because yeah, as I say, that's really what I enjoy and where my main passion is.
Yeah. It's very, it is. Once a coach, always a coach, I think.
Yeah, exactly.
Get it out of
Exactly.
you. Just like an athlete, always an athlete, because we bring our athlete mindset into all that we do. And I'm sure that that's part of how you are an academic as well, is like, do your best sort of idea. Right.
Yeah. And I think the science is all well and good, but if you can't, like, you know, as well as anybody, if you can't actually apply it, and it doesn't have something meaningful that can be used with athletes, then it's a bit of a waste of time, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, and that's a perfect segue, because one of the things, and why I was so excited about being able to speak to you in specifically your expertise and your love and your passion for what you're doing, is we as female athletes in perimenopause and beyond have been really encouraged, and it's wonderful to think about our bone health, think about our muscle mass, think about our strength, and to increase. And a lot of the dominant wording to females is lift heavy stuff. It could be another 4-letter word, but lift heavy, lift heavy, lift heavy, lift heavy. And there's this sort of nuance that I want to get into and understand, first from a really basic of what does strength provide us, but then also, like, what are some of the nuances of lifting heavy versus muscle mass versus plyometric power, versus how do we feel like we're actually applying some of this, the research, and as we become, or as we are, endurance athletes. So then we're going to go in this conversation from this idea of like, well, am I supposed to lift heavy all year round? Like, it doesn't seem to work that way. Or am I going to lose it? And because that's the real fear. And I think, and I'm just setting us up for the conversation, so there's a bit of a connection to the research that you're doing that is not necessarily particularly for the female athlete in perimenopause and beyond, but some of the thinking of athletes that we are, and how do we actually do this in a way. So this is the conversation, and let's get started. So the really first, most basic question I have for you is, why strength training? And again, let's kind of couch it in two different ways. Why strength training, period? Why strength training as an endurance athlete?
Yeah, sure. It's obviously a big question, but I mean, we know pretty well that strength training is able to maintain and increase muscle mass, which is really important for metabolic health. It's important for functional living, and then for athletes that are preparing for sport and competition, it's obviously important for their sports performance. I guess a little bit more broadly related to health is we know that it's a really strong osteogenic stimulus. So it promotes bone health and prevents things like osteoporosis. Similarly, it also improves joint health and prevents lower back pain. So it's good for offsetting risk of developing arthritis. Because muscle's such a metabolically active tissue, as I mentioned before, if we were able to maintain muscle mass, particularly as we start to age, that's going to enhance our metabolic health. It prevents us gaining weight and becoming overweight and obese, and offsets the risk of various different metabolic health conditions. I think something that a lot of people forget, including endurance athletes, is that it's also just really good for our kind of psychological health. Like particularly for endurance athletes that are doing fairly low to moderate intensity training on a day-to-day basis. Like it's just a kind of nice break from that to go into a different environment and a different setting, perhaps with a few teammates. And that offers some nice benefits to kind of psychological and emotional health and well-being as well. And particularly for women, as you mentioned before, that are entering the menopause and then through the menopause, it's there's some good evidence that it reduces menopausal symptoms as well, which is obviously really helpful and beneficial. So I think we've covered off most of the main benefits there. There's probably some kind of like sub conversations and bits of bits of evidence that we can talk about, but those are the main reasons why I would want to engage with strength training on a long-term basis.
Yeah. Can you explain to us a little bit more about what is metabolically active tissue? So there's this idea that the more muscle mass you have, the higher your, basal metabolic rate. But then there's also like this understanding of like, what does that actually mean? Does it mean that our muscles are like, needing more energy all the time? Or is it when they're in motion that they're actually using, and like it's the burn rate, like that I'm actually kind of curious about, like, what does it mean to be metabolically active tissue?
Yeah, so I guess if you compare it to sort of other tissues in the body, such as ligaments and tendons and bones, they don't have the capability of kind of contracting and relaxing. So they don't use any energy. Like as physiologists would know that as kind of adenosine triphosphate or ATP. So they're not capable of turning over any energy, whereas muscle does. So when it contracts and stretches under tension and then shortens again, it will be using up energy at that muscle level. So the more muscle we obviously have, and the more that we move around, the more energy and the more calories that we're burning. So like it's essentially like a kind of engine or a furnace where we're using a lot of calories and a lot of energy with the more muscle that we've actually got. So in terms of just pure health outcomes, that's obviously a really good thing, because when we're eating various different foods and taking in a lot of calories, the more muscle mass we've got, the easier it is to burn through those calories. Whereas if we've got quite a low muscle mass, or we've lost quite a lot of muscle as we go through aging, it's very, very difficult to burn off and use that energy that we're intaking. So essentially we end up putting on weight.
Why I think this is interesting and why I asked the question is because if we were both like, if we're all just like lying and not doing anything or sitting at a desk for long periods of time, we're not actually like, we've got to remember that the muscle, when it's contracting, is using energy. When it's moving, it's using energy. When it's engaged in movement, period, that's when it's metabolically active. And this is why doing an hour a day of something and then sitting the rest of the day isn't necessarily going to find the benefits of this beautiful metabolic tissue that you're working so hard to maintain and have. It's about movement all the time, to be using it and to activating and to using energy and to providing our body with some flow as well.
Absolutely.
So, with that, okay, so now we've got that down. Let's get into understanding this idea of muscle mass and the different types of strength training, and for our listeners. So we've got strength training for strength. We've got hypertrophy training for getting our muscles bigger. And then we have other types of training, and I'm going to open it up to all the things that you want to talk about plyometric, or, when we talk about ballistic kind of whatever. training. Can you help us understand the different types of training we can do and how those are connected, or is it one or the other? Like, we want to, so many times we want to put it in a nice box. This is strength training. This is hypertrophy training. And this is, and does it work like that, or is it more on a continuum of understanding?
Yeah, things are certainly more on a continuum. I mean, it's probably helpful to start off just by defining what we kind of mean by strength and strength training. And this depends a little bit on which textbook you open as well. So there are kind of subtle differences of opinion across different authors in the field. But I mean, when we're talking about strength, we're really talking about a kind of biomechanical quality. And it's really the maximum amount of force that a muscle or a muscle group can produce under a certain set of movement constraints. And so, yeah, to use a couple of examples, it depends on how fast that we're moving. It depends on the length that the muscle's working at. It depends on the movement pattern that we're trying to create. And so just because somebody is very strong in one movement pattern, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to be very strong in another movement pattern. Otherwise, you would have like the world's strongest men or the best powerlifter in the world being exceptionally good at things like high jump and long jump, which obviously isn't the case. Like those athletes are very, very good at producing force in their own specific skills. And so, yeah, sort of linked to that, there's probably three main types of strength training that at least I've spoken about in some of my research. And the first one that I think most people associate most with strength training is just resistance training. So that's just the act of kind of moving a resistance, which could be as light as your own body weight for complete novices, or it could be a little bit more traditional resistance training, which is going to the gym and going on resistance machines or picking up barbells, dumbbells, and kind of moving external load. So that being the resistance against gravity. And yeah, if we train very, very more of a kind of neural benefit, so we don't tend to put on quite as much muscle mass, and that'll promote maximal strength gains. Whereas if we go sort of kind of heavy to moderate type loads, which allows us to increase the volume of work that we're doing, both within a set and within a session, and then how often we're doing that per week, that tends to promote more of a kind of hypertrophy type benefit. So they're probably the two main types of resistance training, and hopefully I'm not boring you too much here. The second main type of strength training that you alluded to before is probably best phrased kind of like power type training. And this is moving light to moderate loads as fast as we possibly can, and use the term ballistic before, which essentially just means we're trying to accelerate the mass through full range of movement and almost kind of like letting it go. And so we're not kind of stopping at the end of the range of movement. And so examples of this would be doing like a jump squat, like throwing a medicine ball, doing weightlifting type skills. So I mean, kind of like clean and jerk and snatches. All of these types of exercise would be better for sort of like power and explosive strength development. And then the third type of strength training, which you mentioned, is plyometric training. And essentially this is taking advantage of something in the body called the stretch shortening cycle, where we get a muscle to stretch under tension very, very quickly, and then we get it to shorten. And we get a better benefit in the shortening contraction compared to if we hadn't have done the lengthening contraction before it. And so really simple examples of plyometric exercises would be doing like skipping, like jumping on the spots, jumping over some little hurdles, and then things like hopping and bounding, where essentially the foot's on and off the ground really, really quickly. And we're trying to train those qualities linked to the stretch shortening cycle.
Very interesting. Can you just talk a little bit more? Can you tell us more specifically for those four different things, recovery in between to be able to effectively do the practice? So in resistance training, low rep sort of idea, what is needed for recovery and then going through?
Yeah, do you mean recovery like session to session or within the session itself?
You can do both if available to you. So yeah, like in between a set. So to be able to do effectively 5 reps. So let's say that's really lifting heavy. How much rest do you need in between the different sets? If you're doing 3 sets or 4 sets.
Yeah.
Just to really understand like how do we bring intention? What I'm trying to do is really bring intention to the exercises, because so often what I see is that we're trying to get it all in. And then all
Yeah,
of
sure.
a sudden, you're doing this lifting heavy session, and you've tried to get it all in to one, 45 minutes to an hour or
Yeah.
20 minutes, and you forgot that didn't include the warm up. Like you're just like, what am I doing? And I think that we lose the intention a little bit about what we're trying to do, and then we're like, well, it didn't work. So you can see the where I'm going with this. So the
Yeah,
intention
yeah,
that's
absolutely.
required.
Yeah, and I think because the context you work is with endurance athletes, that kind of complicates things further, because they like very, very short recoveries, because they recover so quickly in between each kind of mini bout of effort. But I mean, most of the research on this, like across heavy resistance training and hypertrophy style resistance training, and then power and plyometric type training, like the interset recovery period, so between each of the individual sets of work that you're doing, it actually doesn't differ too much. And so typically for a heavy lifting session, we'll be using sort of 2 to 3 minutes recovery. And
Okay.
for more experienced athletes, it might be upwards of 3 minutes between the sets. And that isn't too dissimilar to hypertrophy style training, which might surprise you. And if you go back sort of 10 to 20 years, a lot of the literature around hypertrophy type resistance training was, well, keep the recoveries very short, because
Yeah.
we want this kind of metabolic stress and metabolic stimulus. But most of the research that's emerged over the last decade or so suggests that, well, if you keep the recovery short, it means that you can't actually put very much mechanical tension through the muscle. And so you don't get quite as much of a hypertrophy response compared to if the recoveries were longer and you could have more weight, or you could move more weight within the sets. And so most of the consensus around hypertrophy now is that, again, 2 to 3 minutes per set seems to be about optimal, and not to go shorter than 2 minutes.
And
And then
in
similar
that,
with,
oh, sorry, can
sorry,
I
go
just
on.
clarify? If you're doing that 2 to 3 minute, does that mean that you need to be actually resting, or can you be switching out and doing like a superset, which means, for those that don't know, like switching out something to a different focus, or can you keep moving, or is it best to actually recover fully?
Yeah, it's a good question, that. And I don't think there's a ton of research to say whether it's better or not. Like, I think as long as the superset is like an opposing muscle group or a completely different movement pattern that isn't going to compromise the quality of the lift that you've just done or going on to do, then it's probably fine. I think when it turns into a sort of almost like a circuit training style session, or you're just bouncing from one exercise to the next exercise and you're kind of pouring with sweat and you're out of breath and you've got this big metabolic stress, like it's kind of no longer strength training, because the quality is just not there, and it's sort of turned into a bit of a kind of cardio metabolic type session. And so like the amount of weight that you'd be able to lift on the individual sets would be dramatically reduced. And so
Mhm.
you're not really optimizing the type of adaptation that we're looking to get.
Yeah.
Um,
Can I just clarify too with you, is that you mentioned for those that are more for elite, or those with a lot of experience, that they're actually getting more rest. Is that because they're able to tolerate more demand? Is that the idea? Like
yeah,
they're
so if
able
you
to
take,
lift more because they actually have the technique and the ability, and therefore the stress is higher, needing increased rest. Whereas for those that are more recreational, may not have the safety and have the ability, like, to tolerate pain. Like, I'm an endurance athlete, like, we have different levels of pain that we get used to. Is that the idea behind that?
yeah, so with like really well strength trained athletes, they're able to access like pretty much all of the muscle fibers that they've got within a certain muscle group. So they're kind of what we call the motor unit recruitment is very, very high. And so if they can access all of the muscle fibers they've got available to them, it's going to take them a little bit longer to recover
Okay.
compared to a lesser trained individual who hasn't quite achieved those adaptations yet. And
Okay.
so you'll see very well trained kind of power lifters, for example. They probably don't need this amount of rest, but they'll take like 10 minutes recovery between the sets. And it's because, yeah, but like with the individual repetitions that they're doing, it's kind of so stressful that they need the recovery between the sets before they're kind of like even psychologically ready to go again. Whereas, yeah, with lesser trained individuals, it's sticking to something around 2 to 3 minutes is probably fine.
Yeah. I think that you brought up the psychological demand on it, I think, is an incredibly important component there. Because if I think when I'm really focused in on doing my strength training, I literally just can't turn around and do it again. Like I literally, like, I'm just like,
Yeah.
no, just back off for a second. Like that took me a lot of focus to do it correctly. And I think that there's a real component to it. So I think that to encourage listeners to think about like, what is the demand psychologically on what I'm trying to do and the attentiveness to how I'm doing something, because there's a lot of skill and specificity that we're looking for in a movement.
No, you're exactly right. And it's like, I think as we become better trained and we're kind of trying to push our own individual limits, like the kind of, as you're alluding to, like the real effort and intent needs to be super, super high just to keep squeezing a little bit more out. And we obviously don't want to do that every single session. Like it's not great to go to the gym every time and try and hit kind of PRs on every single lift that we're trying to do. But if we are going pretty heavy, then we need to be kind of dialed in and like a high attentional focus on the technique and the effort that's required to move the weight. And so yeah, that probably does build in like this kind of additional recovery time that we might end up needing.
Yeah, really interesting. Okay, so I had stopped you from continuing on to the, the ballistic or the power, the clean and jerk that you were talking about, and then to the plyometric. So let's continue that thread of recovery time intersets between sets, or how we're doing this.
Yeah, and again, it's not too different. I mean, kind of linked to what we were just talking about, the general textbook will say we need a 1:20 ratio, like work to rest.
Okay.
And so like if doing a set of jumps or a set of like fairly light loaded squat jumps maybe takes 10 to 20 seconds, like if we multiply that by 20, like it gives us a rough recovery that we should be having between the sets or the bouts of work that we're doing. And it ends up equating, to roughly about 3 minutes. And it just kind of implies that with power and ballistic type training, like the quality needs to be really, really high. So again, the intent, the effort that we're putting into each repetition needs to be as explosive and as powerful as we can make it in order to drive the adaptations that we're looking for.
Yeah. When you're doing something like, a squat jump as powerfully as you possibly can do, do you aim to do one, or are you aiming to do 2 or 3, or is it kind of like what would be? What is the range that you're looking for?
It depends a little bit on whether, so with a novice, if I'm introducing them to some of these lifts, they'll generally do a few extra repetitions just because of the kind of skill acquisition and the practice time that's needed to build in the sort of technical cues that I'm giving them. So they might go up to sort of 8 to 10 repetitions just to get that kind of practice of work in. But once you've got athletes that are fairly skilled at doing the movements, to get the most out of the exercises, we generally wouldn't go more than 5, maybe 6 repetitions per set. And for some lifts, like the Olympic weightlifting movements, would tend to be down at more like 3 to 4 repetitions per set. And so, that kind of implies that it's really high quality with fairly short durations in the set. So not endurance training, basically.
Yeah, and really thinking about like, how can I actually, one of the things that you're talking about is motor unit recruitment. And one of the things that I want to ask about is, okay, motor unit recruitment and heavy lifting into hypertrophy training. So say you're in a situation that, okay, there's a couple of things that I'm going to throw at you. One, this idea of muscle mass versus maintaining motor unit recruitment. And a lot of women may say, I am concerned about getting big and bulky. And then the response to that is, you would have to work so hard to get big and bulky. It's more about that motor unit recruitment and being able to actually keep the muscle fibers going, especially as we age.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, sure.
Like they'll start to going into, we're talking about type 1 versus type 2, and how we'll actually go more into that endurance. They can either change over or they'll just die. we don't use them at all. Is that correct? And
yeah, pretty much. Yeah.
okay.
Use it or lose it.
Use it or lose it. So like when I'm like, doing sessions with my athletes, I'm always like, just imagine all those motor units, like you want to use them all. And
Yeah.
I guess what I'm wondering, and when we think of getting strong, being strong, motor unit recruitment, trying to keep our muscles that we've got, is there not, when we do something called lifting heavy, and then but we're not able to really lift, like for myself, I'll just use myself as an example. So I can get up to, it's kind of, I need to work into lifting heavy. So I've done my warm up to lift heavy, then I do my lifting heavy, and then I'm just like, I'm starting to not do my form correctly. So I need to stop lifting heavy, but I haven't got enough sets in yet or reps in to actually have the benefit. So then we actually take the weight off, and then I just complete the set with lesser weight. So there's a whole lot going on there. But at the end of the day, when we start to fatigue out our muscles, and does it work like that you're trying to get as many motor units at the beginning to do the recruitment in the heavy resistance training? And then if they're fatiguing, then you're going to be like, this is the way my brain will work. It'll be like, no, you need more. Like, you're getting tired. Like, find the ones that weren't working in that one. Like, we gotta keep it going.
Yeah.
You're recruiting more just because of the fatigue. Does that make sense as a question at all?
I think so, yeah. And there's probably two or three things there. But yeah, firstly, going back to what you're saying at the start, and as I mentioned before, the kind of development of maximal strength. So we're just talking about, when we say the motor unit, it's the nerve plus all of the muscle fibers that it innervates. And so if we're trying to get just more muscle fibers to fire, so in other words, the muscle or the muscle group can produce more force, like intensity is the main driver of that. And so, for a novice, they don't need to lift, like on a kind of absolute scale, they don't need to lift particularly heavy in order to drive a change in motor unit recruitment, to recruit more muscle fibers, because they're relatively untrained. However, when we've been engaging with strength training for a while, we need to keep the repetition range quite short, quite small. So down of like probably 5 repetitions or lower, but keep the weight relatively high, and obviously have quite long recoveries between the individual sets. Whereas kind of at the other end of the scale, even though it is a continuum, we know the main driver of hypertrophy is the volume of work that we're putting through the muscle or the muscle group. So we still need quite a heavy weight, so like moderate to heavy load. But the way that we get the volume is either by doing more sets, so like building up the number of total repetitions that we've done within the session, or training that muscle or muscle group like more frequently during the week. And that builds up how much kind of time under tension that muscle's got at a relatively heavy load, if that kind of makes sense. So somewhere in the middle, there is a bit of an overlap. Like, most people will go to the gym to try to achieve both. And I guess this is where sort of periodization comes into it and so on. But for health, most people will try and hit both ends. Whereas I guess for most endurance runners, or if you're working with a weight category athlete that doesn't really want to put on very much mass, they want to keep the volume like relatively low, but keep the intensity quite high. And so that will allow them to become stronger, but not necessarily put on any or very much muscle mass at all.
One of the things that I'm curious about is, so in saying that, it seems to feel like in social media or in popular, like how to do this right, how to strength train right, it's either one way or another. And are you supposed to, and I'm doing quotations if you're just doing the audio version, are you supposed to lift heavy all year round, or are you really seeing the benefits as we age? Let's just do it as we age, not being sex specific. So males, females, whichever. As we age, is the variability what we're after? Yes, we want to keep the strength, and we want to keep muscle mass, and doing the both will provide, creating different movements, creating variety, creating that tension, muscle tension. Is that really what we want to like aim for in in thinking about, how do I be strong? How do I maintain my strength for longevity and for performance, but maintaining
Yeah.
both?
I think you kind of answered the question as part of the question you asked there. Like for health, I would certainly say both are important. It obviously comes down to what the individual's been used to again. And so for somebody like myself that's been engaging with strength training for several decades now, I know that if I back off on the like if I keep 2 strength sessions in my program a week, but I back off on the amount of volume that I'm doing, like I actually lose muscle mass quite quickly, because naturally I'm quite a sort of endurance ectomorphic type physique, if I let myself go that way. And so, yeah, for someone like me, that I wouldn't say I'm advanced, but someone that's been engaging with strength training for a long time, like I obviously need to keep the volume at the same level if I want to keep the same level of muscle mass. And if I wanted to increase the muscle mass slightly, and particularly as I get older, I'll probably need to increase the volume of work that I'm putting through my muscles. And so like a combination of both is probably important. And this is where a little bit of periodization comes in, where you try to focus on like different types of strength quality at different times of your training year, or just for variability, changing things up every 6 weeks or so.
And you're seeing that for masters athletes, people as they age, even coming into our, in our menopause in their 60s. I don't know if you have done that research. I know, have you done or read the research on that piece too, that variability still wins out?
I don't think there is any research on it really. Like surprisingly, there's very, very little research on like masters age athletes, particularly into 60s. And like those types of athletes, they've probably had pretty healthy lifestyles for decades and decades because of the type of athlete and person that they are. And so the majority of the research is based in those that have got minimal experience and are often from quite sedentary backgrounds. And so usually if you start that type of person on some exercise in their 60s, that's strength training, like they get quite big benefits quite quickly because it's such a novel stimulus to them.
Yeah.
And so I don't think we've got answers in the research around like the best way to periodize or to vary. And it probably comes down to the individual and what their goals are and what they've done in the past, what injuries they've had. And if they are an athlete, what sport they're obviously training for. And then working with a good coach to try and find the right variability and combination of exercises and activities over a long period of time.
Yeah. Can we talk a little bit, when you talk about volume, you were mentioning volume there, and you were talking about, the volume we're doing and the number of times of resistance training a week. And I'm really curious about this. So
Yeah, sure.
can you just dig into that statement a little bit more? And if I'm not being clear, I can further my question to be even more clear.
Yeah, sure. So when I'm talking about volume, I'm mainly talking about volume load. And so volume load within a resistance training session is the load that we're lifting per repetition on an exercise, multiplied by the number of repetitions that we've got in the set, multiplied by the number of sets that we do of that exercise. And so because the amount of load that we lift within an exercise like differs from person to person, but it will generally stay around the same sort of percentage. Like the best way to kind of compare across individuals and in research is just to use repetition volume, which is just reps multiplied by sets. Does that kind of make sense?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's the equivalent of kind of like the amount of time that you spend running or cycling, or the distance that you cover as a runner or a cyclist, but in a kind of strength training context. And so, yeah, we know that that's sort of the main driver of hypertrophy. But if we want to keep the intensity relatively high, because we also know that just the mechanical tension that we're putting through a muscle is also a key driver of hypertrophy. It essentially means that, okay, the load's relatively high. So therefore, in order to increase the volume, I can't do more repetitions per set because the load's already quite high. Like I'm limited with how many repetitions I can do of that at that load. So therefore you stop at, maybe between 5 and 15 repetitions, depending upon the load. You have a break and then you do another set. and increase the volume by either increasing the number of sets or the number of times that you're exposing that muscle or muscle group to that type of stress or stimulus. So essentially the number of times you would go to the gym. And so as a general kind of rule of thumb with novices, most of the research would say that we need to do 10 sets per muscle group in order to develop a hypertrophy response. And it seems to be a bit high for intermediates, so more closer to sort of 20 sets per muscle group. And we know that more elite athletes and bodybuilders will do upwards of 20, 25, maybe 30 sets per muscle group in order to drive like a new hypertrophy response. So does that kind of like answer the question in terms of?
And now I want you to extend it out to your endurance athletes. And
yeah, sure.
When you're working with endurance athletes, your runners, for example, but I could say cyclists, whatever, are we still like, I'm so fascinated by this because when I was a professional athlete, strength training was kind of coming in, but not really. And so I was kind of doing a bit, but not ever regularly. And there's this picture of me, maybe I'll post it somewhere, and I look like this unbelievably muscled, like it is ridiculous how much muscle mass I was like just was holding. And maybe anyways, so what I'm curious about is this idea of load coming from strength training into a repetitive running or repetitive cycling, and there's muscle mass development there just is. And so how do those kind of work together?
So
against each other?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and this is obviously my main area of research. So I could speak all day on this, and stop me if I'm starting to bore you.
Not at all.
I mean, the main reason that it's important for endurance athletes to engage with strength training is, well, probably two main reasons, really. Firstly, we know, we mentioned this right at the start of the call, actually. We know that strength training provides a benefit to exercise economy. So like cycling efficiency or running economy, if we're talking about runners, because we know that exercise economy is partly limited by physiological factors, but it also has this kind of neuromuscular component to it, because it's essentially about how the muscles are producing and dealing with energy. And so if we can change and modify that via strength training, we essentially get these small improvements in exercise economy, which makes us essentially more efficient endurance athletes, and we use less energy for a submaximal intensity. And the second big reason, which I think the reason most endurance athletes will engage with strength training is because it might reduce the risk of them getting certain types of injuries. And obviously with runners especially, the main kind of time loss, the main reason runners take time away from the sport is because of chronic overuse injuries. So if we can reduce the risk of runners getting those slightly using different strength training activities, that's obviously going to be beneficial because it just allows them to engage with their sport for longer.
So are you speaking to, if we do more strength training, we may not have to do as much of the running stimulus because we are activating the muscle? We are we're just managing the load in a better way in terms of the muscular tension that is required to actually do the activity. And
that is a really, really good question. And it's quite heavily debated, that like whether do I need to replace some of my endurance sessions with strength training, or do I add the strength training? Like the majority of the research, and the research that we've done, has added strength training to the program. So you like take a runner, for example, that might be running 40 or 50 miles a week, and that's their kind of habitual running volume. They've never done any strength training before. Like most of the research will take that type of runner and they will add 2 strength training sessions a week to the runner and compare them to somebody that just leaves their training alone. So just carries on that 40 to 50 miles of running. There are a handful of studies that do replace the running or add running to the group that isn't doing the strength training. And like both types of approach to the research question, like they tend to find the same thing. So over a period of a few months, we see exercise economy improve slightly in the group that's been doing the strength training. In the group that's only carried on their normal endurance work, their economy tends to stay about the same as it was before the training period. And so it does seem to be beneficial, whatever type of model that we use, but it probably depends on how much time athletes have got and what they kind of see as important and how much they're willing to buy into it as well.
Yeah. And I would imagine that when we start talking about athletes that are aging or in, getting older, we need more recovery time. So that is when there may be the benefit. I don't know if you know or can point to any research that's looking at, okay, well, as an aging athlete, it will be more beneficial to actually add that strength training, reducing the volume simply because you need more recovery time, and we can't do it all in the same way that we used to. And so getting that long run, but yet we might have to reduce some of the volume elsewhere so that you can actually handle the load, period.
Exactly. So yeah, I completely agree. You probably need to make these decisions at an individual level, and certainly with an aging athlete that's been engaged with endurance training for decades, like they're fit individuals from a cardiometabolic point of view, but then maybe picking up some niggles, maybe lost a little bit of muscle mass, for example. If they're a cyclist, they might be losing bone density quite quickly. Like, it's probably more important for them that they remove like a session or two of their low intensity endurance work and replace it with strength training because of the health and performance benefits that we've spoken about.
Yeah.
But if you take someone that's a bit young, and like I'm probably a good example of this, even though I'm not a youngster anymore, but like at the moment I'm running about 4 times a week. And so if I want to get better at running, it probably makes sense to do a bit more running, because I've always strength trained. Like, I've strength trained for the last 20 to 30 years. And so if I just want to get better at running, like 4 times a week probably isn't sufficient in order to optimize my endurance performance. So as someone that's on quite a low mileage, and then you come at them and say, oh, I want you to drop some running sessions to accommodate this strength training, like, doesn't really make that much sense, because they're not doing very much already.
Yeah. Oh, you're right. I could talk to you all day because I'm like, and then let me think.
Yeah.
I want to just really make sure I'm utilizing the time most specifically. So one of the things that I wanted just to make sure I asked about is this idea of economy. And if I have an athlete, say really long endurance, an Ironman athlete, or even a half Ironman athlete, and they keep on feeling like their core is not strong enough, and doing strength training, they have a really high load because they're Ironman or 70.3 or whatever marathon, or let's ultra endurance runner, and they feel like they just aren't strong. Do you have any thoughts on, like, I talk a lot about breathing and ensuring that we are actually utilizing our breath to can keep that core and that cylinder, strong. But what do I need to be thinking about as a coach to support those athletes that are doing strength training twice a week? I don't know where else to fit more in. Like, what are we missing?
Yeah, and I think with a specific case study of an athlete that's complaining about fatigue in a specific place, like, I think my first kind of train of thought would be, well, try to think as holistically as possible about it. Like, it might not be a sort of neuromuscular strength type problem. It might be something to do with their biomechanics.
Yeah.
As you mentioned there, it could be the way that they're breathing a little bit that's kind of overly fatiguing certain muscles around their trunk. So yeah, I'd perhaps think, a little as broadly as possible about the different factors that might be causing fatigue in that area. And if I did come to the conclusion that, okay, they're pretty weak in that area, like, doing some specific and targeted strength work for the muscles in that area would probably make sense. I mean, some of the kind of traditional resistance training exercises that we use, such as back squats and deadlifts, and even exercises like different lunge and stepping type patterns, like the amount of activation that we get through our kind of core and trunk is pretty high, even compared to exercises that isolate that part of our body. And so we're getting a pretty good stimulus already from just doing kind of multi-joint traditional resistance training. But you could potentially add some supplementary type work, which is fairly unfatiguing to that region. And I mean, something we haven't spoken about at all, like we're kind of treating strength training and resistance training as like sessions per week.
Yeah.
But one way that you can get, particularly endurance athletes, to organize their strength training is not to say, oh, we're going to go to the gym twice a week, but you can split it up into kind of like smaller blocks or units of training, which have just got a few exercises in, but you spread them across the week. So they end up doing like a small amount of S&C on almost every single day of the week. And if there's a particular injury or weakness that you've identified in an athlete, it's quite a nice way of organizing the S&C, because it means you kind of microdose the stimulus all the way through the week. And so for a scenario like you just described, that might be the best type of approach, to like a small amount of kind of core work every day, but nothing that's too fatiguing and affects their endurance training.
Yeah, and they can get it done because it's only 10 minutes.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they're just like, oh, just tack it on. It's only one workout. I think that's one of the hardest things for like triathletes. It's just like, how many workouts do we have? And it's that idea of like, you need to keep to one workout, otherwise we have lives and whichever. Maybe I shouldn't say one more question. Another question I just have is like, in the economy of thinking about strength training and why it's so good, is it beneficial, like before you in a taper, is the idea from the neuromuscular component is that the activation, like we talk about when you're in a taper, you are actually like, it's not about getting more fit. It's about recovering. And I do like to have my athletes continue to do very light loads, but I ideally like thinking about, you are working your glutes, you're doing the squat properly, not with weight, but like you're actually really understanding the motor movement that you're having. How does that come into the research and what you recommend?
Yeah, there's not a ton of research around how S&C should be used as part of a taper with endurance athletes. So I'm mostly speaking from experience here. And if like usually if I work with a coach, a technical endurance coach, it's them that's kind of dictating the program. So if they say they ain't doing any S&C for the 3 weeks before a major competition, like there's no S&C going on. It's kind of their decision. If they want my input and they say, okay, what sort of S&C should we be doing in these final few weeks? Like my general principles would be the same as what the athlete would usually be doing with their endurance work. So that's trying to maintain frequency. And so if they've been doing 2 S&C sessions per week, like I try to keep 2 S&C sessions going per week. We reduce the volume by about half. So like chop the number of sets that they're doing in half. Often reduce the number of repetitions that we're doing per set as well. We maintain the intensity, as you were kind of alluding to. So, and if anything, the intensity might go up a little bit. And so if they're doing less repetitions and less sets, they're kind of coming at each set a little bit fresher. And so it can be a little bit higher quality. So they can move the bar a bit quicker, or perhaps just shift a tiny little bit more load. And the recovery stay like roughly the same. And so like I try to follow the same sorts of principles as they'll be using with your endurance work, and then have usually the last strength session at least 72 hours before the major competition. So it's usually like 4 or 5 days before the big event.
Yeah. And it's interesting. I'm so glad I'm asking these questions. It's interesting because this idea of feeling flat, or this idea of like endurance athletes, often they are focused so much on getting the endurance in, the long distance in, to try to have the confidence that I can do the distance, that it ends up feeling that they're just kind of like, that it's like, this big, heavy movement, right? And so this is where the strength training really, I think, is ideal in the process, that we really can hone in on this, and not to be, I think that we as athletes really need to come up against what are the fears, and what are the fears of not is it not recovering, and understand a little bit more about our body and our recovery process, so that we can utilize the benefits of like, why would we be doing it for economy and then stop doing it right before we're going to need the most economy, and thinking about how does our muscles work in this optimal way by working the muscle.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I think if endurance athletes are feeling very flat, And like I imagine the athletes that you work with, they bounce back pretty quick from that if you give them enough kind of rest and recovery and downtime. But if that goes on long term, it's definitely either related to overtraining, or something like the Red syndrome that we mentioned right at the start of the call. So I'd be more looking at that. And yeah, I think with the role that strength training kind of plays there is, like we've already said, it gives them a bit of break from the monotony of the long, slow distance, moderate intensity type work. It fires up those higher threshold muscle fibers that we've already spoken about. And it's then just a case of just being careful around how you dose it, particularly during periods of very, very high volume endurance training, such as on training camps. That if that's also the time that they're doing really high volume S&C, like it's just kind of multiple stresses layering on top of them.
Yeah.
And I mean, one way I tend to periodize the S&C, and I don't think you'd find this in any literature anywhere, is that I'd usually sit down with the technical coach, look at the overall training macrocycle and year, and kind of work backwards and make sure that the S&C is preparing the athlete for the cycle that's about to come with the endurance training, if that makes sense. And so if they're going to be going away to altitude and they're running on trails and it's kind of off-road and it's causing like a different stress to the foot and ankle in particular, like the S&C will try to prepare them for that training camp, if that makes sense. If they're going into a higher intensity block of running, where I know the hamstrings in particular are going to be exposed to higher velocities and loads, it's like, well, let's do 6 weeks of hamstring bias S&C work to get your hamstrings ready for the high intensity block that's about to come. Whereas I think if the S&C layers over the top of what the endurance training is doing, it's kind of too late, and you might just be adding to like the high stresses that the athlete's already experiencing.
Absolutely brilliant. Yeah, it's super smart. Like, how do you get, like, where are we going to try to gain our strength? And then, there's this idea of, and many coaches are still coaching with this way of like the base training phase in the winter, which is also really great for the strength training. And so how are you matching it up? How are you preparing right for that spring session that's going to be, really hitting some more of those races and the speed? And so switching it through, it absolutely makes entire sense.
Yeah. And the S&C as a sort of periodized plan, it ends up looking almost like a slightly shifted volume and intensity plan compared to the endurance work, in a simple sense, I guess. But it's always going to come down to the individual and obviously the sport they're preparing for.
Okay, this is my final question on that, because you just have to ask it. So one of the coaches that I follow is Steve Magnus, and
yes,
love him. And he, in one of his books, he says he leaves no zone behind. Now, I don't know if we're, like, there's a different terminology that he probably would use now, and like the zones and whichever. In any case, this idea of variety and not ever leaving something out. Like, we're not going to ever stop sprinting. We're never going to stop something and entirely in doing it. Do you have the same sort of approach in your strength and conditioning thinking, is that we don't leave something behind, even though the focus may be shifted a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really good question. We almost touched upon this as part of an earlier question, but like generally with those that are fairly new to S&C, which is a lot of endurance athletes, like you can actually organize the S&C in a very, what I call like a concurrent way. And so when we're talking about the heavy strength training, the explosive and power type training, and then the plyometric work, like all three of those different activities can go into the same session with a novice, because the novice doesn't need an enormous amount of stress or stimulus to create an adaptation. And so as little as doing like 6 sets of resistance training for the lower limb in somebody that's completely new to it is going to be enough to cause a stimulus. Like, you don't need to do 20 sets because they won't be able to walk the next day. And so if they're doing a warm up and 6 sets, they can either be in and out of the gym in less than half an hour, or you can be like, well, actually there's time to do 3 sets of explosive strength training, and there's time to do 3 sets of low intensity plyometrics. And so when you add that, it's then like a 45, 50-minute session, and it's a bit more meaningful for them.
Yeah.
But then over time, you do need to start biasing. Okay, this is mainly going to be a resistance training session, or this is just going to be an explosive strength session, or we're going to do a plyometric training session. Because more experienced athletes, like they need the volume and the dosage in order to create the adaptation.
Yeah. Yeah. Any problem with doing a run off of a strength session? Easy run?
Yeah, I think that's okay. So the run after the strength session.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's generally fine as long as it's an easy run. I think trying to do a session would be problematic.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, doing a run before the strength work is sometimes difficult. Like elite athletes tend to get away with it because they recover so quickly and they can just kind of absorb a lot of work. But with younger athletes and those that are lesser trained, like if they arrive at the gym having done a 45-minute run, I'm a bit like, well, you're going to be tired for what we've had to do.
Right.
And
then the
are.
intention and the actual quality goes down. They're not lifting.
Exactly.
So therefore their motor move, like their patterns of movement may also have shifted because they're collapsing or doing whichever. So really being aware of what your ability levels to do that are. Perfect.
Yeah, yes, yeah, completely. Yeah.
Okay, well, I know that I've taken a lot of your time, so we're gonna come to our final 3 questions. Are you ready? Unless there's actually, let me first ask before that, is there anything that I mean, I could ask a lot more questions and I might have to ask you back.
Yes, sure.
But for part 2. But is there anything that I haven't asked you that you really was thinking, that you were thinking in preparation for this conversation that we've missed out on that you wanted to get across?
No, I don't think so. We've covered some really good ground there. I think the other important message just to put out to people that are doing strength training for the first time is that it's obviously sensible to try and get yourself a qualified coach. I think those that are nervous of going into a gym type environment, like it makes it a little bit easier if you can go in with a trainer or an instructor that's qualified and they can just kind of show you around either machines or some just basic exercise techniques to ease anxiety levels and just make sure that you're doing it safely and effectively.
I cannot say enough about that. I even for those that feel like they've had a lot of experience and are coming back into, because there's a lot of athletes in perimenopause and beyond that are re-engaging, we could say that, like, and re-engaging in, and our bodies have changed so much, particularly if you've done what I've done, is like have a baby at 40 and then you're coming into that perimenopause period. It's just like my body's not the same as when I was athlete, and coming back in and just having those eyes on. I absolutely love my personal trainer, Sue at Victoria Boot Camp. I'm just going to throw that out there. And, it makes a big difference just in feeling okay and safe to do hard things.
Yeah, absolutely.
Super cool. All right. Rapid fire questions for you. What are you thankful for right now?
I'm mostly thankful just for being uninjured and healthy. Going back to my own running training. I've always been an endurance athlete, but the main reason that I switched sports from running to rowing was injury. And every time I try to come back to running, which is pretty frequent, I get into pretty good shape for me and then usually pick up a niggle. But at the moment, touch wood, I'm good and running all right. So I'm grateful for my health.
Amen. What advice do you wish you had learned 10 years earlier?
I think just trying to enjoy the process and the journey, whether that's in a work-related context or in a sports training context. I think I've been guilty in the past of just putting too much pressure on myself to produce a given outcome or a performance. And yeah, you kind of just lose sight and don't necessarily enjoy the process to get there.
Does that ever resonate with me? Yeah, I think getting older has been a lot more fun for me because
it's probably an age thing.
so much better when you get older. What is a quote or saying that you live by?
We were talking about this a little bit offline. Like when I was younger, I used to have a lot of quotes that I used to live by. But I'll steal one from Steve Magnus, actually, and you mentioned Steve as part of the conversation, but I find myself saying this to my athletes like fairly frequency, and that's consistency over intensity. And it's really because, again, something we've spoken about, like I think athletes will go to the gym and they will do every single training session, like sometimes as hard as they possibly can. Or they will just try to hit certain paces or targets every single session. And I think it's more important just to get the job done, session in, session out, not prioritize the intensity too much. And that consistency over time allows people to reach their goals rather than becoming injured, ill, overtrained, because they're just trying to strive for intensity in every single session.
Amen to that. And to really listen to your body, and sometimes just like letting it just be. And if it's not there that day, then that's okay.
Exactly.
If we get in such a rush, we feel like we have to, because that's how our society runs. It's just like, get it done, like today's the day. Yeah. And I think that's exactly what you were talking about in the quote. It actually is, there is tomorrow. And I learned that in Kenya when I was living there, is that it's very time is circular. There's always has to be tomorrow, because nothing runs on time. So
right.
Like it isn't linear, whereas we always don't have enough time here in the culture, like North American culture, and same probably in Europe. There's not enough time. We're always trying to claw back it, wherein it just feels different. And maybe that was my experience there, because I'm North American going to Kenya, and it's just like nothing happens on time. So yeah, interesting. I also want to just mention that you were a contributor to the Myths of Menopause.
Yes.
Book that is coming out, which is really exciting. And Dr. Nikki Kay bringing us all together and putting it out there. And we'll make sure that we have the link on your page so that you can read more about the chapter that you have. And what was the name, or what was the idea behind your contribution?
It was essentially just about strength training. So myths associated with strength training as women age and through the menopause.
Perfect. Well, I really hope that people will grab a copy and read a little bit more about what you have to say, and to follow you and the work that you're doing. It is so appreciated, this conversation. You have no idea. And thank you.
No problem at all. And thanks again for the invite.